Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the question of when Christians divide, Acts chapter 15, verses 36 through 41. We left off with the Jerusalem Council. That was Acts 15, the first part of chapter 15, all the way up to verse 35. And the issue there had been the question of whether Gentiles need to become Jewish, if they need to get circumcised and begin doing all of the elements of not just the Jewish law, but the ceremonial laws in order to be part of the church, because the church prior to this had been exclusively Jewish. And so, can Gentiles be part of the church? Can they remain Gentiles? And I have suggested that Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, give a parallel account to this. It speaks of Paul going to Jerusalem and meeting with people like Peter and with James. Well, that's echoed in Acts 15, chapter 15, verses 1 through 35. So I think these are two different relatings of the same story. Now, as we pick up, we're about to go on the second missionary journey. We're getting ready for that, and so we're looking at the organization and who's going to be going where. That's going to begin now in this passage. But in the interim, I want to suggest that something else has taken place, and that something else was back there in Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 through 21, where Paul relates a story of Peter having come to Antioch, and Barnabas is there, and Peter, and some folk that are coming from James, and they come into the place where the Christians are meeting and they're eating together, and there's Jews and Gentiles all together. And when these outside Jewish visitors come from Jerusalem, Peter and Barnabas get up and remove themselves, and Paul confronts them. And he tells about that confrontation in his epistle to the Galatians, about how he confronted Peter. Now, Barnabas, he mentions Barnabas as part of that, that Barnabas was sort of carried along by their action. And Peter was rebuked by Paul in this, and maybe Barnabas a little bit too, if only by implication. Now, I mention that because I think it might play just a bit of a part in the feelings that have been engendered and in the relationship between Paul and Barnabas. You see, Galatians chapter 2, verse 13, it says, the rest of the Jews joined him, that is, joined Peter in hypocrisy, with the result that even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy. So Paul says, Barnabas, he was acting the part of a hypocrite. He was saying one thing, but he was acting out another with relation to this whole issue of, can Gentiles be saved? Can they be a functioning part of the church, even though they haven't been circumcised and aren't keeping the various Jewish laws? Do Gentiles have to become Jewish in order to be saved? That's at the heart of the matter. Now, our story opens, verse 36, after some days, and I'm assuming that's taken place, but notice Paul said to Barnabas, even though there's been that confrontation in the past, Paul said to Barnabas, let us return and visit the brethren in every city in which we proclaimed the word of the Lord, and see how they are. They had already gone on missionary trip number 1. He's going to suggest, let's go back and go through that same mission trip, not a different mission trip. We'll go back to all the same places and see how they are, see how the churches are growing. We haven't heard from them. Out of sight. We don't want them to be out of mind. And so let's go back and check up on them. Verse 37, Barnabas seems to be good with that, but he wanted to take John, called Mark. Notice the John, Mark, he has two different names in the same way that Paul has two different names. Remember, Paul has the name Saul, which is a Jewish name, and also Paul, which is a Roman name. Well, that's the same thing is true with John, which is a Jewish name, but he's also called Mark, and Marcus is a Roman, it's a good Latin name. And he has both of them. And remember that John or Mark, and I'm going to call him by either name or maybe both. I suppose I could call him John Mark. He is the nephew of Barnabas, and notice he wants to take Barnabas wants to take him along, but Paul kept insisting that they should not take him along, who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. Now, that story we saw back in chapter 13, Acts 13, verse 13, where they had been leaving. They'd been leaving Cyprus to go to the mainland of Anatolia, and Paul and his companions had put out to sea from Paphos, that was on Cyprus, and came to Perga in Pamphylia. But John left them and returned to Jerusalem. And apparently, that was not a positive thing, at least in Paul's mind, that his leaving was viewed as something of a desertion. That is, when the going got tough, for whatever reason, we're not told what it was, but apparently Paul did not think that it was a good reason. And so he says, let's only take those upon whom we can depend. And he views John Mark, as undependable. Well, verse 39, and there occurred such a sharp disagreement that they separated from one another. Here's this missionary team that they've been through sort of hell and high water in every sense of the word. They separate from one another, and Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. After all, Barnabas, if you remember from way back in Acts chapter 4, Barnabas was from Cyprus. And so he takes Mark and he goes back to the island that they had been to, but also the island from which he had originally come. So these were sort of his roots. Verse 40, but Paul chose Silas. Remember, Silas had come up with them from Jerusalem. Had he gone back? Had he hung around? We weren't quite sure about that. But he chose Silas, who apparently was there, and left, being committed by the brethren to the grace of the Lord. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the brethren hadn't committed Barnabas and John Mark. We're just silent on that. And so we shouldn't necessarily draw a conclusion. And notice verse 41, he was traveling through Syria and Cilicia. And after all, Paul was from Cilicia. He was from Tarsus, which is a Cilician city. So we had Barnabas going back to his old stomping grounds, to the island from he came from. And we have Paul going to the area from which he came, and taking Silas. And but he's not going to stop there. He's going to continue strengthening the churches, and eventually he's going to go back into Anatolia, but we'll see that next time. Now, what do we make of this disagreement that led to a separation of Christian workers? I'm going to suggest that what we have here is a principle of functional division. That is, there are times when groups of Christians find themselves, for one reason or another, disagreeing with. It might be, it doesn't have to be doctrine. It might just be a matter of opinion or even preference. But the two parties feel so strongly that they find that it would cause further divisiveness to try to work together, because neither side can come to an agreement. Now, it's great if they can come to an agreement and find a way to work together. I think that's the better solution. But if that cannot take place, then sometimes, rather than continuing the divisiveness, it's better to actually physically divide and say, well, we can work separately. We can sort of agree to disagree and work separately and continue doing our own separate work for the kingdom. I want to suggest that there's a number of denominations that have done exactly that. And usually I look at denominational differences, and frankly, sometimes I feel that there's just way too many denominations. Some of these divisions were not necessary. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe some of them have been necessary, because separately they can each do work of the kingdom, and they can do it. And sometimes, loving each other when you're sort of prickly can be like two porcupines trying to snuggle up to each other. They keep sticking each other, and maybe it's easier for them to love from a distance, and perhaps that's what happened here. Now, I say that because at the end of Paul's life, End of Paul's life, he's going to write an epistle. This is 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 11, where Paul is in prison. He's waiting he's waiting his final execution. Not that he's been executed before this, but he's been on trial all sorts of different times. But this time he can see that the end is approaching, and he writes to Timothy and he says, "Only Luke is with me." And he's writing to Timothy to say, come soon, because because I haven't long for this earth. But then he says, pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for service. Had Mark changed? Had Paul changed? Or maybe it was just the situation that had changed. But something's different. And now these Christians that had problems working together in the past are going to find a place to be useful to one another.